Hey guys, so it's a stormy, gloomy day outside, and I think these are the perfect conditions for another chapter. Pardon me though, I do have a bit of a cold today, so I'm struggling just a little bit with my voice. But that's no reason to delay chapter 4, am I right? I think you're really going to like this chapter. I don't want to give anything away, but I will say that it is very intense and has some good surprises. It's fun to see some of your comments down below. It looks like so far everybody is Team Will. I already know what happens because I know the story of my ancestor. But it's fun for you to read along with me, knowing that you don't know, and to hear your speculation in the comments. So I don't want to give anything away. I think we should just go ahead and jump right into it. Let's get started. Chapter 4. It was the Dance of the Year, the 24th of July celebration honoring the saints' entrance into the valley. No pains in preparation had been spared. The huge central Bowery on Temple Square beckoned invitingly with its roof of freshly cut water willows, and the board floor scrubbed and waxed to a dull smoothness. Every home was astir with last-minute preparation, a dress to be pressed, a button replaced, hair to be washed, cake to be turned. An electric current of anticipation rose to a crescendo throughout the city as the late afternoon hours melted into early evening. When the Oakes family arrived at Sarah's, she and Martha were ready to go. Charles introduced his brothers Will and Philip and his sister Mary Alice to Martha. Her heart went out to the sad-eyed girl. "Welcome to Deseret," she said. "I hope things will be easier for you from now on." "Thank you," the girl smiled quietly. "We're glad to be here." "We'd better get started," suggested Charles. "Can't afford to miss any dances tonight, and it's quite a walk to the Bowery." Then turning to his sister, "Feel up to it, sis?" "Of course. I'm all right." Will purposely kept in the background. Sarah's eyes, searching for his, rested on Phil, standing between them. He was the tallest of the three, but bore a striking resemblance to his brothers. She liked him instantly. Though he was past 19, he reminded her of a shy little boy, very anxious to appear manly and mature. "Hello, Phil," she said, offering her hand. "Is Salt Lake what you expected?" She liked the grip of his hand against hers. She gave back the pressure. She despised limp fingertip handshakes. They exposed the insincerity of the individual behind them, Father had once said, and he was right. She'd put it to the test many times. It was foolproof. A man's character could be read by the way he shook hands. "What I've seen of it," Phil was saying, "but I've slept most of the time since we arrived. I thought the journey itself would never end. You'll like it once you get acquainted. Everyone will be at the dance. You won't want for partners. All the girls will want to dance with you. Even you?" "Shall we go then?" interrupted Charles. "How about Carrie?" "We're taking her along. No one to leave her with," answered Martha, adjusting her shawl. "I'll take this cape for her to sleep on." Then turning to the child on the sofa, "Why, she's sleeping now." "Then let me carry her," offered Will, taking the cape from Martha and lifting the little girl so as not to disturb her. Sarah's eyes watched as he settled the child comfortably in his arms, letting her head ease down against his shoulder. Was he used to this sort of thing? That he moved with such ease? Puts me in mind of Father. He always cared for us kids that way. Remember the time he slipped his silk handkerchief under my cheek when I complained his coat had whiskers in it? That was, let me see, yes, before we left the Isle of Man. Such a long time ago. "Get your shawl, Sarah," said her mother. "It's on the foot of the bed. Won't need to lock up. No one ever bothers anything here." She turned the lamp wick low. "Everyone out? See, all right?" She leaned her face close to the top of the chimney, gave a quick puff, and the room was in darkness. They walked 3 abreast, Charles, Sarah, and Phil in the lead. Will, Martha, and Mary Alice followed close behind. Martha's heart yearned toward the motherless girl beside her. She put out her hand and took the cold, thin fingers in her warm, friendly clasp. Mary Alice was past 17, nearly 2 years older than Sarah, but she looked like a frail, bewildered child. "Are we walking too fast for you?" Martha asked. "Oh, no, I'm fine," protested the girl. But there was a strained weariness in her tone. Sarah made the introductions as Will and Philip rose politely to acknowledge her uncle's proffered hand. Bishop Holt, a kindly, fatherly man with sandy hair and sideburns, approached through the crowd. He nodded to Sarah and was immediately made acquainted with the Oaks family. "It's a pleasure to have you here," he said in his friendly manner, shaking hands heartily with each brother in turn. Then, noting the pale, exquisite face of their sister, whose hand had felt so fragile and lifeless when she offered it, he continued, "We must do something to bring back the roses to this young lady's cheeks. But you've come to the right place, my dear. The most wonderful climate in the world. With plenty of rest and sunshine, you will be fit as a fiddle before you know it." Then turning to Martha, he asked, "What do you hear from John, Martha? Any news yet?" As he spoke, he sat down in the place vacated by Phil, between Martha and Mary Alice. The latter edged near the end of the bench to make room for him. Noting her shyness, he arose immediately. "I didn't mean to crowd you, child. Here, you slide over next to Martha, and I'll sit on the end. I can only stop for a minute, then I must find my wife and dance with her, if she has the twins to sleep. She's up near the southeast corner somewhere." He leaned over toward Martha to catch her reply. "Pardon me, Martha. There is such a racket. I didn't hear what you said." Charles felt an instant and unreasonable dislike for these 2 men. He could not catch what was being said above the sea of noise all about him, but he resented their easy familiarity, as he termed it. He had gradually become obsessed with the idea that every red-blooded man in the Mormon Church, married as well as single, was or could be a direct menace to his own future happiness. For, he reasoned, believing as they did in plural marriage, what man, seeing his vibrantly beautiful, bewitching Sarah, wouldn't be eager to capture and possess her? He became aware of Uncle William's voice. "I declare, I guess I'll have to sit this one out. My feet aren't what they used to be. Looks like there's room for me over there on the other side of Martha, next to the little girl." He made his way to the spot and eased himself cautiously down, being careful not to disturb the sleeping child. Charles withdrew his smoldering gaze from the older man and muttered something into Phil's ear. Then, turning to Sarah, he gave her a hand squeeze, saying, "I must speak with Will, dearest. I'll leave you with Phil. If you will excuse me, I'll only be a second." "I declare, I guess I'll have to sit this one out. My feet aren't what they used to be. Looks like there's room for me over there on the other side of Martha, next to the little girl. I'll only be a second." He drew his older brother aside that they might not be overheard. They moved past the various knots of gaily chatting couples into a small empty space near the fire, where Charles could keep an eye on Sarah. He could see her talking to his tall, bashful brother, who nevertheless felt very important in his new role of protector. His head was bent toward her uplifted face as he watched and listened attentively, lest he lose a word of what this alluringly angelic creature was saying. The shadows of the huge fire played over the crowd where Phil and Sarah stood. But the beauty of the scene, thrown into sharp yet changing relief by the soaring flames, was lost upon Charles. His one and only concern was of that slip of a girl who had become the center of his universe. Will, too, allowed himself to look long at the girl, now that he was sure he was unaware of his eyes upon her. He had fought desperately, hour after hour, to put the thought of her from him, reminding himself over and over that it was useless. He was honor-bound, as a brother, not to become involved. Yet now, as his hungry gaze absorbed her feminine loveliness, he prayed anew for strength to resist the longing that rose in him, to hold fast to his resolve to keep away from her, leaving the field clear to Charles, who claimed her. Then, suddenly, with a determined effort, he tore his eyes from the girl and turned a little impatiently to his brother. "What did you wish to say to me?" he asked. "Just this," Charles answered in an undertone, glancing quickly about to make sure they were not observed. "I want you and Phil to dance with Sarah as often as possible tonight. We won't give these meddlesome old men a chance to annoy her. I don't trust that uncle of hers. He may be the go-between for some old duffer, for all we know." So anxious was he for Sarah's sake that he did not perceive the sudden pallor that swept over his brother's cheek, nor the tensing of the muscles in his lower jaw, though they were now directly in front of the brilliantly blazing fire. Will hesitated a moment, then replied, "I had intended sitting most of the dances out with Mary Alice. She isn't feeling any too well, you know." "But you've got to help me out. You don't know these dang polygamists. There's nothing they won't try to get a good-looking girl. She doesn't have to dance with them unless she wants to. She wouldn't hurt their feelings by refusing them. They are her friends." There was no mistaking the anxiety in his voice. He continued, "She told me as much just now when I mentioned it to her. Then what can I do about it?" "Dance with her yourself, man." "Are you not afraid of me then?" His words were low but clear, as though dragged from him against his will. Charles heard them, but missed their significance. For just at that instant the music began again, and he turned in haste, catching Will's arm. The intervals between dances were not long, allowing the couples just time to catch their breath and select new partners while the musicians retuned their instruments. "Come," exclaimed Charles, "we must." He choked back an oath as he saw Sarah being whirled away from the spot where he had left her. A tall, handsome, middle-aged man's brilliant blue eyes smiled mockingly back at him over the top of the girl's head. "There!" he grated through clenched teeth. "You see? Even Phil is no match for those devils. You see how he stands there gaping after them like a whipped puppy? The fool! I told him to look after her." "Stop acting like a fool yourself." Will caught his brother's arm in a grip of steel, drawing him back into the shadows. Several couples paused on their way to dance to get another glimpse of the two strikingly handsome men who resembled each other so closely. "That's Charles Oakes," exclaimed Mary Fletcher to her partner. She had crossed the plains in Captain Mill's company. "The other must be his brother. Aren't they handsome?" Ida Wilkie, Mary's friend, answered. The two girls were walking with their partners around the Bowery. They had arrived late and were looking for a place to put their wraps and lunch basket before dancing. "I wonder if Charles is as crazy about Sarah as ever," mused the Fletcher girl. "He never danced with anyone else but her all the time we were crossing the plains. And that time she was kidnapped by the Indians. Do you remember how he nearly went crazy? I'll say he was the one that finally fired the cannons that scared the Indians away. I wonder if she'll marry him. He'll have to join the church first, I'll bet. But he doesn't strike me as being the religious type." The two girls had been talking while they removed their shawls. The boys had been silent, waiting for them to dispose of their things and join the dancers. They were becoming slightly impatient. "Here's an empty bench," urged Tom Bryant, Mary's escort. "Let's put our things here and get in on this dance." Meanwhile, Will succeeded in restraining Charles's angry impulse to return to their party at once. Instead, he drew him further back from the dancers, walking westward toward West Temple Street into the denser, unlit shadows of the night. No stars were visible. A distant rumble of thunder rose ominously above the blaring rhythm of dance music. You can't dominate the girl, Charles, he spoke slowly, choosing his words. She isn't your wife yet. That's just it. If she were, they'd let her alone. Let her have a little fun dancing if she wants to. Surely there's no harm in that. Charles stopped and half turned back toward the Bowery. I can't stand it, I tell you. I could kill that devil, whoever he is. Shut up that kind of talk. You must get control of yourself. She mustn't see you like this. Being well acquainted with Charles's quick, stormy temper, Will felt genuine concern for him. He realized that jealousy and love had stirred his brother's emotions into bitter turmoil. Perhaps that man was just another relative, he suggested. Relative? Heck! Charles took his handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his forehead. There's only one relationship he'd want to claim. You know that as well as I. Didn't you see that smirk on his face when he saw me? Dang him! I know his kind. I'll go back there. Will caught his arm savagely. You'll do nothing of the kind. We'll walk around the grounds until this dance is over. When you get control of yourself, we will go back like gentlemen and act like men. You can't afford to appear as a jealous fool. If you start a fuss on such slight pretext, Sarah will never speak to you again. She has done no wrong. You would only succeed in embarrassing her before her friends. That's the one sure way you can turn her against you. Now pull yourself together and act as though nothing at all has happened to upset you. Can you do that? I'm all right now. Then we'll start back. Remember, no rough stuff. Sarah, meanwhile, was undergoing an entirely new experience. The man with whom she was dancing had appeared suddenly before her. As she and Phil stood together talking, waiting for the music to start, Phil had not yet asked her to dance, but she knew it was his intention to do so, even as it was her intention to accept. In fact, the very words were on the tip of his tongue when this dashing stranger had presented himself, bowing low before Sarah, saying in a deep, masculine voice, I am John Lee, from Parowan, Iron County, Miss Mills. Your father and his party stopped at my home on his way to California several weeks ago. He said to look you up if I came to Salt Lake. I asked if you were here, and Brother Taylor pointed you out to me. May I have the pleasure of this dance? Almost without waiting for a reply, Lee had placed his arm about the girl's waist and swung her out onto the floor in perfect time to the old dance melody as the opening strains of the waltz broke forth. They danced for a time without a word. Sarah was still trying to adjust herself to the suddenness with which this man had carried her off, leaving the bewildered Phil standing alone and nonplussed, unable for a time to collect himself and step back from the jostling crowd of dancers that swarmed about them. Not until hours later did she realize how cleverly the man had plugged her possible refusal to dance with him by his mention of her father's name. It was he who spoke first. His deep bass voice was distinguishable even above the swirling tumult. Your father said he had 2 daughters. You must be the older one. Yes, the other is just 3 years old. Did you meet my mother, sir? She will be so glad to hear the news of father. We've had no word since he left. I haven't met her yet, but I hope to do so during the course of the evening. Then tightening his arm ever so slightly, he whispered into her ear, You dance very well, Miss Mills. We must get better acquainted, you and I. Tell me about my father. Was he well? How long did it take him to go to Parowan? He was hale and hearty when he stayed with us. I believe he said they had been 12 days on the road. Neither spoke again for a time. Sarah suddenly longed for the dance to end. They were in the darkest part of the floor, the very center. The crowd seemed denser here, though the deepening shadows obscured the moving figures. Often they bumped squarely into first one, then another swaying couple. The stranger had gradually increased his pressure on her as they danced, until now he held her body crushed tightly, suffocatingly against his own. She was angry, frightened, and thoroughly uncomfortable, yet seeming helpless. She remembered with terrifying vividness her ride in the arms of the Sioux chief, weeks before. Then her terror had succumbed to her hot, blazing anger, so that she had dared to bite her captor savagely with her mouth pressed against his naked chest. Her timid struggles to free herself were fruitless. She realized with a start that she was in the arms of another, a different kind of savage, one who dared insult her by taking advantage of the darkness and her helpless position as his partner. Should she sink her teeth into this brute? He deserved it no less than the Indian. She was seriously contemplating the idea when the man, as though reading her very thoughts, suddenly relaxed his hold and began weaving his way with her back toward the outer part of the floor. They completed the dance without further complications. Not another word passed between them until the music stopped. Then Lee addressed her in his most charming tones, as though nothing had transpired to upset her. "May I now have the pleasure of meeting your mother, Miss Mills?" With all her heart, Sarah longed to slap the man's face. Instead, she lifted her eyes in a blistering look of scorn, then fled, leaving him without a syllable. She almost ran headlong into Charles and Will, who were nearing the platform as she stepped down from it onto the ground. Charles caught her in his arms, at the same time peering anxiously down into her flushed face. "Sarah!" He felt the convulsive quiver that shook her. "What is it? What happened?" "Nothing, Charles." She knew him well enough not to let him guess that she had been insulted by another man. She lied gallantly. "But I'm dreadfully thirsty. Do you suppose you could find me a drink of water?" "But why were you in such a hurry?" he insisted. "I didn't want to be late for the next dance, silly. I promised it to Phil." "Then why isn't he with you now?" Will, placing his hand on Charles's shoulder, intervened. "Let's find the water, Charles, or she won't get back in time." "I'll get it. You sit on that bench with Sarah till I come back. It will give her time to catch her breath." "All right, but don't be long." Charles disappeared toward the rows of tables stacked with lunch baskets. He was baffled and irritated. Was Sarah merely thirsty, as she declared? Or was there some other reason for her leaving the pavilion in such haste? He thought of her flushed face and trembling body, of the tall stranger with whom she had danced. Something must have happened, but what? However, remembering Will's caution about creating a scene, he had offered to go alone for the water, that he might curb his rising suspicion and regain his self-control. Nevertheless, he promised himself he would have it out with her later, when they were alone. Will led Sarah to the empty bench beyond the fire, and they sat down in silence. Couples passed to and fro between them and the blaze, casting long, oblique shadows that moved grotesquely ahead in gigantic strides. Waiting for her to speak, he studied her face in the firelight, noting the firm set of her mouth, where not the slightest pretense of a smile now lingered. She held her hands tightly clasped in her lap, as though to hide their nervous trembling. Her eyelids flickered shut as she drew a deep breath which escaped in a slight shudder. He realized that something had happened to upset her, something she was afraid Charles might discover. He longed desperately to help her, yet he somehow knew by the proud tilt of her chin that she intended to ask nothing of either Charles or himself. He was glad she had not allowed Charles any further cause for alarm. Nothing could be worse than to create a scene at such a time and place. Yes, at all cost, Charles must be kept out of it for the present. Finally, he broke the silence between them. "Is there anything you would care to tell me, Sarah?" "I'll help you if I can." He saw her lips tremble, yet she kept her voice steady as she answered. "There isn't time now, but thanks just the same." "Does it concern your last dancing partner?" "Why do you ask that?" "Because if it is something that should not be allowed to pass, he made me angry, that's all. I've never been so, she faltered. "I think I understand. I'll see that he doesn't have another opportunity to annoy you tonight. If you could do that, I shall be eternally grateful." The tension she had been under was revealed by her look of relief. "You're not to worry any more. I'll take care of everything." His calm, reassuring voice soothed her. "Did you say you were to dance the next one with Phil?" he continued. "Yes. He didn't get a chance to really ask me, but I'm sure he intended to." "Very well, then. May I have the one after that?" His heart hammered as he spoke. "Oh, yes! I'd love to dance with you, Will." And suddenly, by her animated tone, the protective reserve so painstakingly erected by him to safeguard them both was completely shattered. He had determined earlier in the evening to avoid any personal contact with Sarah, fearing this very thing. But after seeing her whisked away by the stranger, from Phil, he had felt the same reaction Charles had expressed, even though he would not admit it, even to himself. Added to this was Charles's plea. He was between two fires. It was the realization that she needed his help that made him reverse his decision. He must go through with it now, come what may. "Charles is coming with the water," he said, glancing up. "Oh, yes," she answered, rising. "We must hurry before the music starts." Charles watched her as she drank. He said nothing when she drained the glass, but he seemed much calmer as they returned to the pavilion. Though not so experienced as his brothers, Phil was an excellent dancing partner. Scarcely a word passed between him and Sarah during the entire performance. Each enjoyed the perfect coordination of the other's time and movement. It was a great moment for Phil, dancing with Sarah. He had anticipated it since first Charles had made the introduction. The boy had fallen completely under her spell. Sarah had entirely regained her composure. Her face was serene and calm. The faintest smile touched her lips, and her cheeks had lost their angry glow. She appreciated the polished refinement of this cultured English lad, who treated her with such deference and respect. He gave her his arm in the most formal manner when the dance was ended, and led her back to their corner. There he bowed politely and thanked her for the dance as though she were indeed a princess. He reminded her of what Charles might be like were he to drop the mockery which so often tinged his words and actions. She and Phil were the first to reach their rendezvous, but they were rejoined almost immediately by Martha and Charles, then Will and Mary Alice. They stood grouped together for a time before seating themselves. Charles stepped to Sarah's side, saying as he placed his hand on her shoulder, "The next dance is mine, darling. You've danced only once with me so far this whole evening." "Sorry," she answered, smiling straight up into his eyes. "You're too late. I've promised the next one to Will." "What? When did he—" "While you were bringing the water." Well, the next two following are mine then, remember." Seeing the fatigue in his sister's face, Will led Mary Alice to the bench and sat down beside her. Martha followed, then Phil, leaving Sarah and Charles standing together. "Would you like to sit down until the next dance, Princess? Or shall we walk around the grounds?" he asked, looking down at her in the glowing firelight. "Let's sit down, shall we?" she answered, trying not to be too eager, for she determined that nothing must keep her from this next dance. "There's room on that bench right next to Mary Alice." "Anything you say, sweetheart." He put his hand on her elbow as they moved toward the others. "By the way, darling, I haven't told you how ravishing you look tonight," he whispered close to her ear. "I like your dress. You're stunning in blue. I'm more crazy about you every minute. You'd better hurry up and marry me, because if you don't, I'm going to kidnap you." She did not answer as they seated themselves beside their companions. Suddenly, mid the noise and hum of the crowd, the bugler blew a blast on his horn for silence. Everyone on the dance floor and surrounding the pavilion stopped in his tracks. Silence settled over the vast assemblage. The president of the dancing committee mounted the platform and announced, "After the next dance, which will be a waltz, we will have an intermission, during which time we will enjoy our refreshments. The Nauvoo Brass Band will play 2 concert numbers while we eat. We have sandwiches, donuts, and punch for those who did not bring their own. Luncheon headquarters are east of the Bowery. Thank you." A ripple of anticipation ran through the crowd. Then the sound of their voices once more filled the night air. As the first notes of the waltz broke forth, Will rose and stood before Sarah, bowing at the waist. In a single movement, she was on her feet and in his arms. Charles sat staring after them as they moved out onto the uncrowded floor, moving together in perfect synchronization. Slowly, the strangest feeling crept over him. "Are you not afraid of him, then?" surged through his brain. It seemed as though all the blood in his body had suddenly been drained away, leaving him absolutely numb, with no power to move or speak. Then they were lost from sight, swallowed up in the ever-increasing swirl of dancing figures. Presently he flexed his fingers nervously to dispel their numbness. Giving himself a mental shrug, he began reasoning. What's the matter with me tonight? I must be seeing green. I'll be jealous of my own brother if this keeps up. Good old Will, he's 1 in a million. I wish I were as cool-headed as he. He'd die for any one of us. He's the one person I know I can trust. Never had Sarah known such rapture. She forgot everything, the repulsive stranger, Phil, Charles, all except the exquisite, newfound ecstasy in the magic circle of this man's arms. She had but one wish now, that this moment might never end. All that had gone before in her life seemed but the pathway leading up to this hour. She had been conceived, born, and reared, but for that great spiritual and physical awakening to the meaning of that awe-inspiring emotion called love. If, as she had been taught, marriages were made in heaven, she was, and always had been, since the beginning of time, this man's mate. Never for an instant did she doubt but that Will felt exactly as she did. He did not crush her to him in the darkness, nor utter words of endearment, but the power and depth of his feelings communicated itself to her in the gentle pressure of his hand holding hers, in the firm yet tender strength of his arm encircling her. The communion of spirit with spirit was stronger than words. They moved as one single graceful body, oblivious of their surroundings, drugged with their newfound joy in each other's nearness. Charles turned to his sister, who sat so still and quiet beside him. He had not yet danced with her during the evening, and hoping to give her a little pleasure, he asked, "Do you feel like finishing out this dance with me, or would you rather just rest?" "I've danced only once so far. I'm sure it won't hurt me. And I like dancing with you, Charles." He led her onto the floor. Martha and Phil were already dancing, as was everyone else who could find room on the overcrowded floor. When the last notes of the waltz died away, Sarah and Will found themselves near the extreme northwest corner of the Bowery. He stepped down to the ground and helped her to descend. They took several steps northward before either spoke. It was Sarah who finally broke the silence as they moved on slowly, uncertainly, in the increasing darkness, hand in hand. "Will?" Her voice almost a whisper. "Yes, Sarah?" He felt her hand tighten over his. "We can't go back to them." Her pleading tone pierced his heart, yet he dared not yield. "We must, dear Sarah." His voice caressed her like a soothing strain of music. "Not for a few minutes, Will. Please, let's walk around the block first. I must talk with you. We can go out this west entrance and round to the south, then in that gate. It will only take 5 minutes. Please." He stood for a moment, resolute. It was very dark. No stars were out, and they were too far from the bonfires for him to see her face. "All right," he declared. "Perhaps that would be best." They moved on in the darkness, each clinging to the other's hand. "This way," she said, turning westward and drawing him with her. They reached the sidewalk and began walking south toward the corner. The velvety blackness of night enfolded them in a blanket of utter seclusion. They were alone at last. Instinctively, they drew closer together, each vitally conscious of the other's nearness. "Sarah," a wild, sweet thrill shot through the girl as he spoke her name. "What, Will?" "I'm going away. Back to Philadelphia." He felt her body stiffen in the darkness. She clutched his arm with both her hands. Then she was seized with such a fit of trembling that her whole body shook. He put his arm around her to steady her. She clung to him desperately, forcing back the painful sobs that rose in her throat. I was sure you felt the same way as I do," she said brokenly. "Sarah, you are dearer to me than all else in life. But you are my brother's promised wife. God help me. What can I do? I must go." "You cannot leave me. I do not love him. Never will I give myself to another. I would rather be dead." There was a strange new fear in her voice. She reminded him of a terrified child groping blindly in the dark. He forgot his own misery in an effort to relieve hers. "You shall not suffer because of us. It is for that very reason I intend to go away. Then you and Charles can go on together, the same as if I had never entered your life. I never knew what life could mean until you came. It has changed everything. The very air I breathe is sweeter. I felt it when you first took me into your arms. And when you kissed me, I thought you were Charles, remember? I believed that God himself must have wrought this wonderful change in the man who was to be my husband." She spoke with earnest simplicity, without the shadow of coquetry or guile, straight from her heart. Her words affected him as nothing had ever done before. "So it was with me," he answered solemnly. His arm pressed her ever so gently. She responded instantly as a harp to the touch of the master's hand. He sensed, rather than felt, the relief in her as she listened to him. "In that brief moment before you spoke," he continued, "a wondrous feeling of indescribable bliss was mine. I felt I had found my mate, that perhaps God had guided me here to this faraway valley in the mountains for that very reason. Not until you called me Charles did I realize our mutual mistake. The only real mistake," she said, and her voice was steady now, "was when I thought I loved Charles. Now I know that it was only the part of him which resembled you that drew me to him. But he will never understand." They began to move forward again, walking very slowly, his hand holding hers in the darkness. "We turn east here," she said as they came to the corner. Then she continued, "We will go to Charles together and tell him the truth. We'll make him understand." Knowing Charles as he did, Will was convinced that her plan would but rouse his brother to greater jealous fury. They were nearing the south gate of the temple grounds and would join the crowd in another moment. There was no time for further discussion. "Listen, Sarah," he said. "Charles must not be told yet. This thing will be a far greater blow to him than you realize. If a way can be found to spare him, we must find it. But he must know, sooner or later. Not tonight." The 2 bonfires had been replenished with dry logs and were shooting gay showers of sparks like living fireflies into the sky. The tables had been placed near the fires for light. Women and girls were spreading them with sandwiches, cakes, salads, and pies. As Sarah and Will approached, a middle-aged woman who had been peering from the edge of the crowd hurried out to meet them. "There's Aunt Louisa!" exclaimed Sarah as the plump little figure drew near. "Sarah, I've been watching for you!" There was anxiety in her voice as she continued, "I don't wish to alarm you, but the girl, Mary Alice, seems to have taxed her strength too far. She collapsed while dancing with her brother a few minutes ago." "Where is she?" exclaimed Will. "I must go to her at once." His face in the firelight looked suddenly tired and drawn. Sarah felt an ache of sympathy cut through her heart as this new worry descended upon him. She felt an intense longing to clasp him in her arms and comfort him. Instead, she could only give his hand a reassuring squeeze, as they both waited for Aunt Louise to explain further. "Your brothers and my husband are taking her to Mrs. Moore's house. Dr. Richards was right here, and he says she'll be all right in a few days. But she must be kept quiet and have absolute rest." "Where's my mother?" asked Sarah. "She went along with them and took Carrie. I waited to tell you to, so now we can go at once. There wouldn't have been room for us to ride anyway. If we walk right fast, we can get there in no time at all." They turned and started back through the south gate, walking rapidly. And that's it for today's chapter. I would love to hear your comments at this point in the book, so be sure to share them down below the video. I hope you enjoyed that, and I will see you next week for Chapter 5.